Welcome to everybody. I'm Jeff Get, American Purpose. This is a pleasure. We have a distinguished academic and book author named Fritz Bartel. I know Fritz because he was kind enough to host me recently at his university, Texas A&M, on the said that other school that's represented by Mark Colmar today. I don't mention that today, but Texas A&M, I got that right. And Fritz, you and I met about a month ago. You were kind enough to invite me down to speak about Ukraine with a group of students, and we had a wonderful conversation. And you were kind enough to agree to this discussion today. Fritz has a new book out. It is called Triumph of Broken Promises: The End of the Cold War and the Rise of Neoliberalism, 2022, Harvard University Press. Fritz is an assistant professor at the Bush School at Texas A&M. He's a historian by training, Cornell, PhD. He's been an associate director of international security studies at Yale. He writes beautifully. He knows how to tell a story, and he is solid gold as a historian. So welcome to everybody. It's a 45-minute program today. We will stop at 12:45 Eastern sharp, and we're going to get you into the conversation as quickly as possible. But I'm going to indulge myself and ask a first question or two. But first, Fritz, congratulations on the book and welcome, and thanks for being with us today.
Thank you so much, Jeff, and thank you to all of everyone who's joined in the audience. I'm really looking forward to your questions.
Fritz, I'm going to start in a very mundane but pedantic sort of way, but bear with me. The rise of neoliberalism. Gosh, what a word we hear a lot about today. And you do provide a definition. Can you tell us, can we start there? Tell us what is or what is understood by you, or how do you use the word or term neoliberalism?
Absolutely. That's a fantastic place to start. I define it in the book, I think on page 4. So I don't leave people waiting for long, as a political ideology that uses markets to increase the free flow of goods and capital across state borders, to increase inequality within societies. And that, I think that's a very key piece of the neoliberal vision, particularly as it was enacted in the 1980s, and then also decrease the state's role in the provision of social and economic security for its citizens. So it's really, the means are the use of markets, and it attempts to achieve these three ends of increasing the free flow of goods and capital across state borders, increasing inequality as a means of restarting economic growth after a period of stagnation in the 70s, and then also decrease the state's role in the provision of economic and social security.
So thank you for that. Fritz, every problem, in my view, has, if not always, frequently, different lenses through which one can look and study the problem at hand. And of course, you as a historian have methodology. You start your work by telling a story, and that's 1989 and the end of the Cold War and celebration across the West, from Helmut Kohl in Germany to the leadership across the West, Europe, the United States. But you also start early on with the story of an individual, a Hungarian pensioner. Can you tell us how you set up the piece and why this juxtaposition from the get-go?
Absolutely. Yeah. I started with this. So it's a man named László Kezdy, a Hungarian pensioner, and I came across an open letter that he wrote to the Hungarian finance minister in December of 1989. And I really start the book as I believed or had thought about the Cold War, that why wouldn't the end of 1989 be a celebratory moment for many, many people in both East and West? And instead, he's writing this letter very sarcastic in tone, in which he says, he basically lists the ways in which his economic security is evaporating before his eyes. The government is raising the price of everything around him. They're trying to offer him a Christmas bonus to partially compensate for some of these increases in the cost of living. But it kind of pales in comparison to what the cost of living crisis that he's facing. And so he very sarcastically asked the finance minister to send him a long rope, for which he does not think he needs to specify the use to which this will be put, but a long rope so that he can lighten his burden on the state budget. And so I took this when I found it in the archives as a kind of as a historian, a crystallizing moment, when an event that we think we know, that we know the meaning of, seems to have a very different meaning for at least important segments of the populations that experience them. And so if people like Kejdi were experiencing the revolutions of 1989 as something that, at least sarcastically, they wanted to end their lives, that seemed to point to a kind of both a different meaning and potentially a different causal story of why the Cold War came to an end. And so I then immediately juxtapose it to Paul Volcker about a decade earlier, receiving some similar pushback from people as he raised interest rates, of course, through the roof in the early 1980s in the United States. He got various forms of protest and pushback, but was ultimately able to achieve this without the U.S. government collapsing in any way, which sounds kind of ridiculous as a possibility. But if we leave open the idea that capitalism and communism were both facing these challenges of imposing economic discipline, as I call it, or breaking promises, then it becomes a question of why were capitalist societies able to impose this discipline without collapsing, and why did ultimately communist societies, as they attempted to impose this discipline, why did that lead to their collapse? And so that's really the jumping off point for the book.
So I'm just going to pop around a little bit to get some more material on the table that people can dig into in the discussion round. So you push back a decade, I'm going to push back, or rather push forward a few years. It's not just the story you tell at the top of a individual Hungarian pensioner to set up and frame your book, Fritz, but you also can spend a considerable amount of time talking about the role of a Polish finance minister named Balcerowicz. Why him, and how does he figure into your story?
Yeah, so Leszek Balcerowicz, either famous or infamous in both Poland and I guess the broader world as the man who came up with the Balcerowicz plan, which was the first non-communist Polish government's attempt to impose shock therapy. He wouldn't think of that as a derogatory term per se, but many people, of course, do. And so he is able to enact this program of radical market reform in the immediate post-communist period. It leads to, of course, a dramatic increase in unemployment, a dramatic decline in real wages, a decline in economic growth, all of which he believes are in some ways necessary and overdue economic corrections for the economic mismanagement of the communist period. And what I try to bring out in the book is that often this moment is looked at as in a sense, the neoliberal moment in Poland that arrives after communism. So neoliberalism is a consequence of the end of the Cold War. And I try to kind of, in a sense, reverse the causation and say that these pressures that Balcerowicz was responding to were in fact building up over 2 decades and led ultimately to the collapse of communism in Poland. And so I also bring up this important communist Polish official named Mieczysław Rakowski. And he, in his diary, as Balcerowicz is doing this, kind of very, very defeated and tired, I imagine, by the end of 1989, as he's tried for over a decade to reform Poland to no avail. He writes in his diary that basically Balcerowicz is saying the same things that he, the communist, said, and yet society is accepting these things because they believe that it's coming from our government, as he writes. And so that's why in the book I make the claim, I try to put forward the argument that democratic legitimacy is ultimately very, very important to these processes of breaking promises or these impositions of economic discipline, because populations that feel that it is, in a sense, their government that is enacting these policies, were much more amenable to accepting them without kind of providing significant social resistance to them. And so that's ultimately one of the keys, I think, why democratic capitalist societies were able to meet this challenge of breaking promises, and state socialist or communist societies were not, because they didn't have any kind of democratic legitimacy.
So Fritz, now that we have 3 or 4 dots out there, could you connect them for us? And for the benefit of those who have not yet read your book, state for us what the overarching thesis of the book is. And of course, you're a historian and it's a historical work. You have something to say about the peaceful end of the Cold War, but also what happened after, and in a clear sense, how things have evolved since. So could you speak to that a little bit, please?
Absolutely, sure. So in essence, the main argument of the book is that the Cold War began as a race to make promises between communist and capitalist countries, attempting to expand the social contracts that prevailed in their societies. But because of the economic crises of the 70s, so I begin really with the first oil crisis of 73, 74, but really a decade of crisis throughout the 70s. The Cold War morphed into a contest to break promises and to impose economic discipline on your population. So in the 1970s, as economic growth waned in both East and West, finance and energy kind of replaced growth as the sources that governments use to fund their promises to their citizens. So if you were an energy producer like the Soviet Union, you could use your energy wealth as a means of continuing to make promises to your people. If you were an energy consumer and you had to borrow money, like many of their allies in Eastern Europe or Western Europe or the United States, then you became dependent on finance as a way of continuing to fund your social contract, in a sense. And therefore, this race to make promises kind of exists so long as you have access to energy and finance. And once your access is cut off, for either if global markets lose confidence in your country or there's a fall in energy prices, then the kind of structural argument of the book, the structural setup of the book, is that forces governments in both East and West to turn to this politics of breaking promises, this attempt to impose discipline. And the case I make is that it's ultimately these moments where markets or energy or capital markets have forced governments to impose discipline. It's these moments that spur the geopolitical and ideological changes that we now think of as the end of the Cold War. So whether it's the end of the arms race between the Soviet Union and the United States, or the revolutions of '89 themselves, in which very clear evidence, I was amazed to find clear evidence that essentially the roundtable process in Poland and Hungary that leads to the end of communism in both of those countries is an attempt by the ruling government, by the Communist Party, to legitimize or gain society's acceptance of austerity policies. Austerity policies that are being mandated by the International Monetary Fund, because both of these countries are highly indebted and in need of access to international finance. So ultimately, it's this challenge of breaking promises that the book contends, I contend, led to both the peaceful end of the Cold War and the rise of neoliberalism. What are the effects going forward? I mean, I think it lays the groundwork very clearly for some of the alienation and in a sense loss of legitimacy that many governments around the world have faced over the last 10 years in particular, as the rise of inequality, the decline in working class wages or the median income, or stagnation of incomes across the former East and the West in many places. All of that has produced the current backlash that I think we're seeing to the liberal democratic project more broadly. So the pressure to break promises that emerged in the 70s, I think the book tries to make claim, ended the Cold War and produced the rise of neoliberalism. And those processes in turn are now leading to some of the disillusionment and loss of legitimacy that we've seen, particularly since 2016.
So, Fritz, thank you. I'm going to open it up now. I'm going to, in just one moment, call on Mark Fulmore. But before I do, I have the book and have read the Kindle version. So I'm sorry, you all, I can't hold it up to the screen. Fritz, do you have one there at your fingertips? It's don't worry. It's inelegant of me not to have a hard copy to present to people, but don't worry.
I have some pictures of my daughters holding the book. That's about as good as I can do.
That's even better.
Yes. So
better.
My wife gave these to me, and then I started showing them to people. I said, I realized that's not the look you want, because it means that your daughters are like, they have to hold your book to be important or something. That's not the case. But it does serve a purpose in this moment. So.
Well, it does. It means they're leading your fan club, and that's a good thing.
Yes.
So thank you for that. So Mark Fulmore teaches at that school down the street from you. I'll let him introduce himself. Mark has a new book just out called Cold War Radio. It is the story of the Russian broadcasts of Voice of America, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, deep experience in Russian Eastern Europe. Mark, welcome. You have the floor.
Thank you very much. I would have to read your book to see exactly how to frame it. But as someone who started traveling in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union beginning in 1973, someone who knows Belsarovich, I remember meeting with him in 1989, and as well as Valenza and that whole group. I have a very different take on the Cold War, very different. I do indeed see it as a triumph. I see it as something that, just to pose a question, Poland today is infinitely richer than it ever has been in its history. Mm-hmm. Infinitely richer. There's nothing comparison. I mean, you have to see the misery of Poland in 1970s and 80s to understand what a miracle that has been. I mean, just a phenomenal miracle. The Soviet Union was so poor, so miserable, there was no comparison between the Soviet Union and the West. I mean, you were landing on the moon to go to the Soviet Union. And that, I think, has been forgotten because people don't know it, because there is nostalgia in Russia and so on and so forth. So I would need to read your book to see how you're comparing the two. But from my perspective and the perspective of many of us in the Cold War, the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe were basically going to collapse one way or another. They were unsustainable societies. They were based on a totalitarian model that was falling apart. And so it was just a matter of how much time before they collapsed. Now, I would be very, very careful not to draw kind of equality between the two. Anyway, that's my comment. My question to you, though, is, first of all, Hungary is completely different from the other countries. To go to Hungary in 1982 or 83 is to visit a completely different country from Poland or the Soviet Union. It had goulash communism. It had free market stores. None of the other places did. So it's a different country to compare. And so its trajectory is going to be different because it was so different politically. Let's say from Romania. You go to Romania next door, and, you feel like you've landed in in such dire poverty that there's no comparison. You go to Budapest and you're virtually in Western Europe. So that's anyway, my question to you is, how then do you explain the phenomenal success of the Baltic states, Estonia, Poland economically, Czech Republic, if not through a market economy?
Yeah, well, thank you so much. And this is a wonderful opportunity to clarify, because I don't mean to say that things have on it universally been worse since then. The claim of the book is that everyone, the reformers on, let's say, the communist and non-communist side, and society at large, and certainly international institutions, all believed that things would have to get worse before they got better for a significant amount of time, on the order of well, people actually underestimated how long that would be, right? Whether it was going to be 6 months, 1 year, 3 years. I end the book with this, actually one of Margaret Thatcher's advisors, who wrote this line, an upward sloping line of GDP per capita from 1950 to 1989. It was kind of a perfect encapsulation. And he just wrote the West. That's what the West meant. And for him, the UK was falling behind that line. And in order to catch up, it would have to go through a J curve, as he called it, 2 to 3 years, where things would get worse before they got better. And the governing challenge that he believed for Thatcher, and I believe for many governments around on both sides of the Iron Curtain, was precisely that. They had to be able to convince their populations that things would get better, but then things would get worse, but then they actually would get better. And Western governments were able to credibly say this, partially because someone like Margaret Thatcher, Ronald Reagan was a new face and presented a new ideological paradigm. So they were willing to try it out. And they had a democratic legitimacy, which made them, in the eyes of the public, much more credible to make a claim like Volcker essentially made in the United States. We need to go through a recession in order to come out the other side in Morning in America, right? So I think this pressure to institute a J curve doesn't mean that things never get better again. And of course they have, and in a place like Poland, as you say, they're better than they ever were. At the same time, they're also much more unequal than they were under communism. Now those go hand in hand to some degree. What degree that is kind of just the result of a market economy, what degree it's the result of policy, I think is something that we will continue to debate for a long time. But the pressure, the kind of the pressure that's driving the events in the late Cold War is this one of 2 or 3 years, or an unknown amount of time, but a significant amount of time, where things would have to get worse before they'd get better. And it's those moments when political change and ideological change in East and West, whether it's Volcker in the US, Gorbachev in the Soviet Union, or the late communists and eventually Balcerowicz in Poland, they're all responding to this, to my mind anyway, same kind of pressure, where things are going to have to get better before they get worse.
Just to quickly finish up, so Gorbachev told me in an interview in 1993, so this is after the Soviet Union fell apart, he said, look, we all knew it was going to collapse. We all knew the Soviet Union was going to collapse, just a matter of speeding it up or not. Gorbachev's answer. Not that it would get better, that it was going to collapse.
Well, I mean, I think in 85.
Mind you, that's 1993. That's
right. 1987, I don't think I think he was still pretty confident in himself and in his reformed socialist project, right? But certainly, yes, by 93, it was. And to your point, whether or not these things, was there a path by which they could have survived, remains open to me. I don't know. I don't think anything is fully predetermined in history. But at least my book would say they would have had to meet this challenge of breaking promises in order to survive, and none of them, except the Romanians, were able to do that. And in Romania, it's no accident to my mind that it's the one that ended most violently.
So, Mark and Fritz, thank you very much. I want to continue with colleagues in the gallery. And could I call on Dan Chiro and then also Paul DeRosa? I don't know if your hand is up, but I'm putting it up because I'd love to hear from you on some of this. Dan, would you go first, please?
Hey. Well, I have too many questions, so I'll try to limit it. By the way, when in 1970 in January, I drove in my car from Vienna to Bucharest to spend a year in Romania. When I got to Budapest, I didn't think I was in the West. I was sure I was in communist Eastern Europe. Everything was bleak and dark. And a year later, when I came back from Bucharest, you've heard this story before, I stopped in Budapest in the winter of 71, and I thought I was in the West. And, that's the old joke about taking the train from Paris to Moscow, and you land in Warsaw before World War I, and you think you're in Moscow. And when you come back and stop in Warsaw, you think you're in Paris. My question is this, I don't want to spend too much time. Romania is not very well understood by a lot of people who study Eastern Europe. It's much more neglected. There are fewer people. I mean, it's not that it's empty, but there are fewer people who look at it than the more northernmost country. Looking at what's happened much more recently, Poland, which was not nearly as badly off as Romania in the late 80s, and was fairly free, but not as much as Hungary, and Hungary, which was the freest, not counting Yugoslavia, which is always left out because there's been so much violence. Romania today is democratically doing better than either of those countries. Somehow accepts public opinion, accepts the European Union. There's a far right and there's a left protest. People really did suffer. The late 80s were terrible. And then pensions collapsed as everywhere else. And somehow in that country, which so many have said, oh, it remained communist afterwards, which also is not true, and was far behind the more northern countries. The two leading northern countries, Poland and Hungary, have become anti-democratic. So is there an explanation? Does that fit into your schema? And that's my question.
I don't think this is where I hope I'm remain a historian, and I would grant the last 30 years a great deal of kind of contingent weight as well. And therefore it's my story really ends in 1990. And so I don't have an explanation for why those two things, why they, besides some sort of broad reaction in Poland and Hungary to what until various points, either in the mid 2000s or the mid 2010s, was a fairly good success story. I don't have an explanation for why Romania has kind of reversed that trend, but it does seem to have been reversed both in the 80s, as you say, it was the one that chose to impose discipline, and when Poland and Hungary really did not, and then it ends up in a very different place now. But it doesn't really fit in my story, and I imagine the answer lies somewhere in the post-Cold War period rather than in the Cold War period per se.
Fair enough.
So thank you, Dan. I'm going to offer the floor to you, Paul, if you wish to comment, and then after you, James Kelly, Fritz Heinzen, and we'll see where we are. We've got 14 minutes to go. Paul?
I just have one thought, and Fritz, the some interest to value to him on the subject of the inevitability of the collapse of the Soviet system. In I guess it was 1968 or 69, I was a third-year graduate student in economics at Columbia. And once at a student faculty event, I found myself standing next to Arthur Burns, who between stints in Washington was on the faculty at Columbia. And Burns was not the type of person with whom one made small talk. He only lectured, especially with a third-year graduate student. But he had just returned from a tour of the Soviet Union, and he told me in our conversation that the collapse of the Soviet Union was within years, not decades. It was within years. This was this was before 1970. The reason that he said that is that the two fundamental questions of economics are what to produce and how to produce them. And the Soviet Union didn't have an answer for either one, and that collapse was inevitable. I know that there's been a fair amount of and this doesn't relate to the rise of or the greater reliance on markets that Fritz noted, because the question is, if you want prosperity, there's no viable alternative. And I do know that there's been a fair literature on the collapse of the Soviet Union recently, and with a search for means by which the Soviet Union could have saved itself. The issue is whether it was so fundamentally flawed that it really couldn't.
Well, so I think a couple of things that pop out from the book for me. The 73 oil shock was in some ways a new lease on life for the Soviet system, because it provided oil and natural gas became the material basis of Soviet power. It papered over their completely failing agricultural system by allowing them to constantly import very, very large amounts of grain for hard currency. And that, the first production begins to peak in the early 80s and kind of plateaus by the mid 80s, particularly for oil, even though natural gas is starting to take off. Then, of course, prices peak in 1980 and begin a decade long, or longer than that, besides the Gulf War, more than a decade long decline. And it's precisely in the fall of 1985 and early 1986 that it completely collapses, which significantly worsens Gorbachev's plight. At the same time, he's trying to move, as you say, into a kind of market socialist direction. And whether or not that would ever be possible, he was trying to find out if you could actually have market incentives, whether you could have flexible prices and still maintain state control and party control of the system. In his case, of course, he's unable to do it. And I think the thing that I find in the book is actually that it's the lack of control of monetary policy, the kind of the complete subservience of the financial economy to the real economy in the Soviet system that causes the entire system to collapse very, very rapidly from 87 when he starts his reforms to by 89 even, when the Soviet economy is just in really, really dire straits.
Okay, colleagues, I should have been asking people to introduce themselves. Sorry, I didn't. Paul is businessman, investor, formerly New York Reserve Bank, has taught economics at Rutgers. Dan Schroe is a member of our editorial board, has taught and worked at the University of Washington, Seattle, Jackson School, started his career in Eastern Europe and Romania, where he lived, worked, and learned the Romanian language. Actually, sorry, didn't do justice to either of you, but there you are. James, you have the floor. Please introduce yourself, and then Fritz will do the same with you, and we'll see where we are.
Hi, James Kelly. I've just been interested in this field, this area for a great long time. I'm an amateur rather than a professional. I've always thought that the rise of neoliberal economics under Thatcher and Reagan was a rejection of and reaction to Keynesian economics under the Great Depression and FDR. And my question is this. We went through at some point a turning point or inflection point going from the Keynesian economic model to neoliberalism. I'm wondering if we aren't also in that same kind of transitional phase from neoliberalism to something else? I know that's sort of a non-historical predict the future question, but I was just wondering what your thoughts were on it.
So I think we're in a long transitory moment in a way, and I think particularly, I don't think my story is predictive, but if we, to the extent that the 1970s were a decade of growing discontent, funded, and this with a status quo funded by basically real interest rates of zero. And we're moving into a decade, or I don't know how long, but certainly an extended period where real interest rates are returning to significant positive territory, which will cause a great deal of political and economic change, both in the United States and around the world. We're already starting to see it. I do think we're in some sort of paradigm shift towards something else. What that is, I don't know. I don't think anyone who says that they do. I think it's just too hard to predict. But I would say that if my story is predictive in any way, it would say that the next decade is likely to be much more politically volatile and transformative and ideologically transformative than the last decade has been. If you think of 2008 to 2021, 22 as equivalent to 1973 to 1979, so from the breakdown of Bretton Woods in 71 to Volcker in 79, in some ways, political change was on hold and ideological change was on hold during that decade because the previous system was propping itself up, was able to prop itself up. Then Volcker, in a sense, calls the question. He's not, I don't think, consciously doing this, but much of what happens in the next decade, if you look at it from a global political economy standpoint, is just delayed effects from adjusting, or the failure to adjust to the shock of the 1970s. And so I think what we're entering could be, if my story has any relevance to it, it would be a much more transformative decade of political and ideological change than we've experienced even in the last decade, which I know is saying something, because we've had quite a bit of change since 2015, 2016. But
Peter Zion has basically talked an extensive amount about the breakdown of the Bretton Woods American order, globalization order. And his positing is that basically we're talking about Fortress America. It's not his phrase, but reshoring of industries from Asia back to the United States, and demography and geography and how it interplays with ultimately politics and the survival of nations. He's predicting the collapse of China and Russia at different timetables, but I don't know. It seems to be, he seems to agree with you in terms of it being a inflection point for massive change. So,
I mean, to be too deterministic about it, it seems to me that the governing challenge of Russia, China, and the West in the next 3 years at least is much more who can handle the challenge of breaking promises rather than making promises, right? Russia's already in that territory. The West is already in that territory of rising real interest rates, and China is trying through ever more stimulus of various kinds to delay that moment, but would seem to be eventually going to come. And what happens when that does, I don't know, but that's when I think the real transformative moments will arrive.
So, gentlemen, thank you both. Fritz, please introduce yourself, and you're going to have the last word and comment. We've got 3 minutes to go.
Okay, very good. My name is Fritz Heinzen. I was an academic teaching at Notre Dame, and then had the unique opportunity to help reform academic publishing, and I jumped at that opportunity. Very, very quick, all these comments about knowing about when and how soon things might have collapsed in the East. In 1979, I was grabbed by an economics minister while in Belgrade when he saw I didn't buy what he was talking about. And he got me away from the security handlers into a room that wasn't bugged and sat down and laid it all out the real economics and said, Yugoslavia is going to blow apart. We're going to blow apart. And I'm getting my family out either to Hungary or Romania. These comments today all remind me, economists seem to have realized sooner than anybody else how it was going to come apart. Okay, I have a question for you. And it's set up like this. I caught you, we were talking to my alma mater the other day in Bologna, and that was very interesting, where you developed further your thoughts on on capital and so on, what was going on. And it's all very intriguing, because those of us at that time who were in academics or were working in national security, we were looking at why war wasn't coming and eventually why it didn't break out. And we all wrote various things. General Sir John Hackett wrote Third World War. I wrote, I was with Mike Palmer, and we wrote The War That Never Was. And then eventually you had very popular, Larry Bond writes Red Storm Rising with Tom Clancy. And thank God it never did happen. World War III never happened. Your discussion the other day and today really puts in a very interesting piece, I think, of a larger puzzle. And so I'm curious how you view it. We always thought, and that was the point of our books, that there was not, in the end, a military option. Therefore, it had to go peacefully. But we're looking at only a portion of this bigger puzzle. Your argument, as I understand it, and I'd like to see how you put it into any larger context, is that it was going to be a peaceful end. Although we like to think that we had it established at that point via NATO and other, and command of the sea and so on, and maritime, this was the new maritime strategy, all these different things. So how do you put it all together?
Well, and I'll try to do it briefly. I mean, it's, as I ended that talk, and I can say here, I think one of the things that maybe was mistaken at the time, though completely understandable, was that you assumed that the Cold War, which was something happening between countries, was going to end based on something happening between those countries. And in fact, it ended based on how they were relating to their own populations. So I phrase it in terms of the US-China relationship. It's much more likely to be decided by how these governments handle what's going on within their borders than what's happening between themselves. And so all the time that people believed that the Cold War, because it started as a security competition, the security competition must be resolved, or must be what would end it. But how that could end without it ending violently was what couldn't be known, right? All you could do was keep it peaceful at the status quo. But how the status quo would change without it being violent was, I think, always the question. I always go back to Paul Kennedy's Rise and Fall of the Great Powers, published in '87, when he says, there's no precedent for a major empire just kind of walking away, right? And then, of course, 2 years later, that's exactly what happened. So Soviet national interest changes fundamentally based on the energy and natural resource subsidies that they're providing to the rest of the bloc. So not just Gorbachev, but many other Soviet officials by the late '80s just don't believe it's in their interest to defend the communist regimes of the Eastern Bloc. So Gorbachev, I think we've long said, without Gorbachev, there's no way this happens. I think there's actually many scenarios in which Soviet officials, even if Andropov had lived or something, would have basically accepted the revolutions of '89. And so, and why they're doing that is because ultimately, I think, hopefully it's something that we can hang our hat on. Governments care more about their own domestic legitimacy, their whether or not they're succeeding in the eyes of their own populations, even more than they care about national security. At the end of the day, right, Ronald Reagan was elected to end the or regain Cold War footing, but most of all, he was elected to get the American economy going again in a non-inflationary way. Mm-hmm. That's why he got reelected in 1984. So ultimately, governments care most about that. And I think that provides us some reason for hope why great power competition going forward doesn't have to end violently, because governments get backed into these corners and eventually they give up on what they cared about abroad so that they can deal with what they need to deal with at home. And that's this, in my story anyway, that's the end of the Cold War. But thank you for the question.
Well, I'll tell you, thank you. And I'm looking forward to reading the book now. You got me sold on reading it. Very intriguing.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you both for that. Fritz, congratulations on a fine piece of work. The Triumph of Broken Promises is Harvard University Press 2022, The End of the Cold War, The Rise of Neoliberalism. To all of you for your valuable time and a very smart, interesting conversation for 45 minutes. Thanks. Stay with us at American Purpose. Join, read. I'm always obligated to say, become a member, look online, all that sort of jazz. But really, our honor to host you today, Fritz. Your students are lucky. We will continue reading you.
Thanks so much. It was a wonderful conversation. Appreciate the opportunity.